Stanford University.
Okay, all right, well, welcome to Lecture 13 of CS 193P. Today is a rare all-lecture day. No demo today. I'm going to do the opposite on Thursday. I will have pretty much only the first 10 minutes or so will be slides, and then we're going to do one gigantic lecture or a demo that covers everything I'm doing today and the little bit I'm going to do on Thursday. The topic today is core data. Core data, super important technology in iOS because it's the foundation of storage, usually in almost any application that you build. As we go through core data, we're going to take a couple of asides. One is to do NS Notification Center, and one is to do Objective-C, another Objective-C language feature called categories. So we'll just kind of go off for a few slides, talk about those, and come back. The reason they fit in today is because core data uses both of these things, and so it's a good time to introduce it to you. All right, so core data, what's it all about? So we in this class, we're object-oriented programmers. We don't like C APIs, so we don't want to use something like SQL or something like that to store our data. We want to use an object-oriented API, and that's what core data does. It's basically a fully object-oriented API to store data in a database. And the backing of core data, however, is usually something like SQL, okay? And by default, it's SQL, and that's what we're going to use in this class. You could actually, core data is flexible enough, you could actually put a different backing store behind it, which some people do in certain cases, but that's kind of advanced usage. So we're basically going to have an object-oriented database here on top of SQL database. How does it work? Kind of at the highest level, how does core data work? You go into Xcode, and there's a tool there for creating a visual mapping between the objects that you're going to store in your database and then the code that's going to be just normal NS object subclasses, actually NS managed object subclasses. And then core data manages all the interaction between. So once you have this visual mapping created in Xcode, then you can create new objects, put them in the database, delete objects in the database, query for objects in the database, which is really the power of having a SQL database behind it. And then you access the data inside the objects. Really, we're going to eventually just do it with properties. So you're just going to have these @sign properties, and that's going to get the data off of the objects in the database. And core data manages all the communication behind the scenes. So all you're really seeing is the object-oriented side of it after you've created this visual mapping. So let's talk about how you create that visual map, because really until you've created the visual map, you can't really do anything. And it's very straightforward to do. You just do new file, our favorite way to get a new thing in our application. And when you go to new file, though, this time you're going to go down on the left to where it says core data. Okay? So if you have trouble finding this thing, it's because it's in a place we haven't looked before, which is that place core data. And then when you click on core data, you're going to have some choices there. But the one you're going to want is data model. All right, so we're going to click on data model and click next, and that is going to allow us to create this graphical model of what's in our database. And again, we don't have to create any of this SQL to generate any tables or anything like that. That's all done for us. Okay, so what we do is visual. It's going to ask you what you want to call this map. Usually we call the data mapping the same thing as the name of our application. And yes, we could actually have multiple maps, okay, multiple schemas for different databases if our application were very sophisticated. So that's perfectly allowed as well. Although in this class, you're never going to have to do that. So usually picking the name of the app is a good name for your data model. It doesn't really matter what you choose there, especially if you only have one model. It's going to assume that's the one you want to use. So when you do that, you're going to get this look in Xcode. Okay? This is what it looks like to look at a data model file. You can see it on the left there in the navigator. I have this .xc data model D type of file chosen. That is a mapping, okay? A core data object mapping. And what's inside of the mapping? Well, the model consists of three different things, really, or at least three main things. One is entities. Those are going to map to classes. Attributes. Those are going to map to properties. And then relationships, which are properties that are going to point to other objects in the databases. All right? Make sense? So those are the three main things. This thing, fetch properties at the bottom, is actually a very useful feature. We're not going to talk about it in this class just because I got to draw the line somewhere. But it's a way of creating properties that are fetching data when you access them in the database. Other properties are doing that as well, like these relationships, but they're doing it in a little more kind of preset manner. So that's what we're going to talk about today is entities, attributes, and relationships. Okay? So how do we create this? Very simple. We click on this gigantic button at the bottom there. A big plus sign says Add Entity, and that adds another entity. And then we literally just double click on it at the top there. You can see entities and give it a name. Okay? So the first entity we're going to create is photo. So what I'm going to do in the demo today is, or not in the demo, but as I walk you through the slides here, give an example. We're going to have two entities, which is a photo and a photographer, and then obviously there'll be a relationship between the photo and photographer. Okay, very simple, but I just want to show you how to click all the buttons in this view to make things happen. So we click on that entity, we type in the name of the entity there, and this photo is going to basically represent like a Flickr photo. You can think of it that way. The entity is going to appear in our code as an NS-managed object. So that's a very important class, NS-managed object. All objects in the database, when you see them in your code, they'll be NS-managed object stars. Okay? So you can think of NS-managed object as kind of like the NS object of objects that are in the database. All right? The managed means the data backing store for them is managed. Okay? Now, we're also going to show how to create a subclass of NS-managed objects so we can actually have a subclass to use on these entities in the database. But even if we create a subclass, there's still NS-managed object is the basic mechanism for these objects, like a photo that's stored in the database. Now we'll add an attribute. Okay, so this is going to be an attribute to our photo. Again, we can press this big button down here on the right, add attribute. Or we can press the little plus button there in the section about attributes. And when we do that, it's going to put a new attribute in there, and we're going to double click on it, set its name, and then also you'll notice we have an error when we do that, and that's because our title attribute that we just added has no type. Its type is undefined, and that's an error, and it won't let you do that. So we have to set the type. We do that just by clicking on this pop-up right there where it said undefined, and we scroll down to string. Our title is going to be a string. A string in the database obviously is represented by an NS-string object in your code. The other types you can have there are either numbers of various sorts, floating points and integers. Those are represented by NS numbers. Booleans are also NS numbers. Binary data is just an NS data, okay, just bits. An NS date is a date, and this transformable type, again, I'm not going to talk about that, but that's a mechanism whereby you can store something in the database in one of its native formats, like NS data typically, and then when you access the property, it can be transformed into something else, like an NS dictionary or something else, right? Because we can't store an NS dictionary directly, so it has to be transformable. We're not going to talk about that, but that's something for you to know that exists out there. So when you get into this, you'll be looking for that. So notice that all the attributes are objects. Okay? The core data only knows how to put objects in and out of the database, and all the attributes are also objects of various kinds. We are going to get at the values for these objects in a couple of different ways. One way we can do it is we're going to use the NS key value coding protocol, which you've actually already used if you use that method value for key path in your homework assignment. Remember I mentioned that in a hint. So value for key and set value for key are part of a protocol, which actually all objects respond to. NS object responds to it. And they just get and set the value of a key. It's very similar to dictionary. In fact, we know that dictionary implements this by just returning the values of its keys. A normal NS object, when you send it value for key, it actually looks for a property with that key name. And if it can, it'll call the getter and return that as the value. And same thing set. So that's kind of a fun way to set your properties using value for key and set value for key, and we'll see that in a couple slides. The other way to access the attributes is to create a subclass of NS-managed object, because remember all these objects in the database are NS-managed objects in your code. You can create a subclass and then just add @sign properties for all your attributes, and Xcode is going to help us with that, as you will see. All right, so here I've added a whole bunch more attributes here. Thumbnail data I made be a binary data, so I actually stored the data, the image, in the database, whereas the photos URL, I only store the URL. I don't store the huge image data here. Maybe I store that in my file system cache that you did in assignment number 5. And it also knows it has a date, the upload date, the date this photo was uploaded to Flickr or whatever. So you can just add those with that little plus sign. And one thing that's cool is we can see our entities and attributes not just in this table format, but also in a graphical format. So if we click on this little editor style thing in the corner there, you'll see that it shows us the exact same thing we were just looking at, but in a graphical form. Okay? Question?
Why did you not store the photo data in there again? Because couldn't you use that as your cache instead of another cache?
Yeah, so the question is, why didn't I store my photo data in there, for example? Okay? Core data actually can store very large amounts of data, so it would not actually be such a bad idea to do that. I didn't do it just to be different. I mean, just to point out that you can store data or not store data, store it in a file system if you want, whatever. But it wouldn't be outrageous by any means to put something as big as a photo into core data. It's pretty good at managing very large files, okay? And it even has a mechanism to store those files outside the SQL database if you want, kind of like you're doing in assignment 5. That's new for iOS 5. That's a cool feature as well. So core data is for almost any kind of data you can imagine, except for maybe, I'm not sure I put video in there, right? Video might want to be in a file, and in this core data you store a reference to the file. Okay, so this is the exact same thing. Now, why would we want to look at this in a graphical way like this? It doesn't seem as nice as the table way. Well, you can see why when we start adding other entities. So here I'm adding another entity, a photographer. And you can see that now I can see them both, the photo and the photographer, graphically here. I can still double-click directly on any word here to change the name of the entity to photographer. And I can also drag those things around, and it'll automatically position them around the center of the graph, which is kind of cool. So if you have 10 or so or 20 entities and you start dragging them around, it'll kind of smart position them so that you can see them all on screen. And the attributes, you can still add attributes in this graphic mode. You don't have to go back to the table mode. So here I've added an attribute to photographer called name. So this is the name of the photographer, the name of the person who took the photo. And you can see that I'm using the inspector this time to change its name and its type, right? So you can do that there or in the table view of the previous thing we saw with photo. And of course, we can control drag because we love to control drag in Xcode. We can control drag between these entities to create relationships between them. So obviously, a relationship between photo and photographer is that a photographer takes a bunch of photos. So a photo has a relationship to the photographer who took it, and the photographer has a relationship to all the photos that the photographer has taken. So how do we set this up? Well, we control drag to create a relationship. And then once we have created the relationship, we can double-click directly on it, actually. Or again, we can click on it and in the inspector, change the name of the relationship. So here I'm changing the relationship on the photo side to be who took, because my photographer is who took this photo. And it already automatically knows it's a relationship to the photo, to the photographer, because I control dragged it. And then I'm going to click on the other side of the relationship and set it to be photos. Okay, because photos is a good name for the relationship between the photographer and the photos that he's taken. But this one's a little interesting. You'll notice that there's a switch right there called too many relationship. You see that too many relationship? That says that a photographer can have multiple photos. Okay? Now, the photos relationship to the photographer is not too many. All right? It's just to one. You can't have multiple photographers taking one photo. And that's okay. And now they both could be too many. There are some data schema where both sides have too many, and that's perfectly. In fact, in your homework, assignment 6 homework, you might well have a relationship that's too many on both sides. But here we just have too many on one side and too one on the other side. Okay. You can also notice there's quite a bit of other options there. We're not going to talk about things like whether the property is optional. Okay, meaning can it be nil? And if it's not optional, then it might need a default value. So some different things can have default values. This is a relationship, so it really can't have a default value. Also notice that delete rule. You see the delete rule nullify right there? That specifies if I delete this photographer, what happens to all the things that this relationship points to, all those photos? Do they all get deleted too? Okay? Or they just get, their back pointer just get nullified? That's what we have here. Some of the options in delete rule are things like cascade, where it's cascading delete, right? Delete you, and then it goes down to the next level, and if there's no one else pointing to that thing, it'll get deleted too. So again, we're not going to have time to talk about all that, but just know that that exists as well. And then there's also this property transient. That means that this property is in the schema, but it's not actually stored in the database. So this is going to be something that's going to be calculated in code in a subclass of NSManageObject, which we'll see a little bit later. Yeah, so it's automatically noticed the inverse relationship because we control dragged it. Let's talk about the types of these two properties, these relationship properties. The whoTook property, its type is going to be NSManageObject star, right? Because whoTook is a pointer to another object, and I told you all objects, all these entities are represented as NSManageObjects or subclasses thereof, so that's what that type would be. But what about photos? Photos points to a whole bunch of photos, so it's not an NSManageObject star, it's an NS set. Okay, it's an NS set of NSManageObject stars. That make sense? Remember NS set from back when we talked about foundation? It's just a pile of objects, right? It's unordered, it's not an array. It's an NS set, right? It's just a unordered pile of objects. Okay, so that's what the type is going to be in our code. All right, so there's lots of other things you can do in core data, but we're going to focus on entities, attributes, and relationships and what you can do with them. All right. Now that we have a visual mapping, how do we access all this stuff in the code? What does the code look like to access this stuff? The most important thing you need to access any of this stuff is you need what's called an NSManagedObject context. Okay? This is a class. You'll need an instance of it, and you're going to send messages to this instance to do things like queries, and if you're creating an object, you're going to have to specify what context it's in. So all the interaction with the database is going to happen through this NSManagedObject context. All right? So how do I get an NSManagedObject context, right? I need to get one so I can go start adding and querying objects in the database. And there's really two fundamental ways to get yourself an NSManagedObject context, okay? One is to create a UI managed document, which is a new class in iOS 5, and it has a property called managed object context, and you just get it and start using it, okay? So that's the easy way, and that's what we're going to talk about in class today. The second way is when you create your project, you probably notice on sometimes there's a little checkbox that says use core data. Only certain of the templates have that. That's another way to do it. If you check that box, then what will happen is the template will generate some code, and your app delegate, which we haven't even talked about app delegate in this class, we will, but in iOS 5 you need to interact with it a lot less than in previous versions of iOS. But in this case, it would add a managed object context property to your app delegate, and that's how you could get it. Now, I don't really recommend doing that so much in iOS 5 because this UI managed document is such a cool way to do it, and it really encapsulates your core data database into a nice file, a document. And so we're going to focus on the first one. If you want to try and figure out how to do the second one, you're welcome to it, but you won't have to do it in this class, and I wouldn't recommend doing it for your final project. Okay? All right, so let's talk about UI managed document. This is a class that inherits from a class called UI document. UI document is just got a bunch of mechanism for managing a file or a group of files that are related on disk. Okay? So things like saving them, opening the files, having them migrate to iCloud. Okay? So UI managed document is also kind of your window onto iCloud. If you want to support iCloud in your app, you're probably going to want to use UI managed document. It does a lot of the mechanism for pushing things up to the cloud and pulling them back down and stuff like that, which we'll hopefully be talking about in a lecture, maybe even next week. But really what you want to think about UI managed document, it's like a container to hold your core data database. All right? And that container provides a little bit of functionality so you can save your database, open up your database, things like that. All right? So how do you create a UI managed document? Super simple. It only has one initializer, init with file URL. So you just do alloc init with file URL. And the URL you specify is almost always going to be in your documents directory. Remember last time we talked about in your sandbox, you've got a documents directory, cache directory, etc. You're almost always going to create these UI managed documents in your documents directory. Okay, so that's simple. You created it. However, you can't just use it quite yet. Okay, your document has to be opened or created to be used. Okay, so you do the alloc init, but that doesn't actually open the document or create it on disk. Okay, so that's the first thing we need to do when we want to actually use a document. And when I say use a document, I mean get its managed object context and start doing stuff with those objects, the entities in the database, which we're going to talk about in a few slides. All right, so how do we open or create the document? So you open it by calling this method open with completion handler. And the completion handler is just simply a block. You hopefully all used to blocks by now. It's a block that has no return value, and it just takes a Boolean, which is whether it succeeded in opening the file. Okay? And if the file doesn't exist yet, which you have to check for, unfortunately, I always thought it would be nice to have an API in UI managed document, which is, let me use this document. If you have to create it, go ahead, but let me use it. But you don't do that. Instead, you have to call in default in the file manager, you have to call file exists at path and find out whether this document already exists. So if the file does exist at path, you're going to use open with completion handler. But if it doesn't exist, then you need to create it. And the way you create it is with this method in UI managed document called save to URL for save operation. And the save operation you're going to use when you're creating it is called UI document save for creating. Okay? And then it also has the same completion handler where one is done. Now, why does this thing have this completion handler? All right, we haven't really seen APIs that have completion handlers. The reason these two methods have completion handlers, and this is very important, pay attention to me, okay? These methods, open and save, are asynchronous, okay? They take time to do. So they will return immediately to you, but the file will not be opened or created. Okay? You have to wait until the completion handler gets called at some time in the future. Then you can use the document. Okay? Do not ignore this fact. One of the most easy to mess up things is, oh, I did open, and then the very next line of code, you just start writing to your database, and then you get all kinds of wacky errors where it's saying, oh, you know, managed object context, and it can't find database, or, you know, blah, blah. Well, it's because it hasn't opened the file yet. All right? So these are asynchronous. Asynchronous means that they take time to happen, and they call your block when they're done. Yeah, question?
Is that block called the main thread?
The block will be called on the thread that is calling this method. So it'll be called back to this thread. Okay, so if you're calling this on the main thread, which is likely, it's going to call this back on the main thread. If you're calling this in another thread, it'll be called back in that thread. Okay. So what's an example? Here's a very typical code that you're going to have. You're going to have some property called document. It's going to be UI managed document. You're going to set it to alloc init with file. And then you're going to say, if the file exists at path, then open this document. And if I have success, I'm going to call some method self document is ready or something, where I'm going to go do something now. And if it's not successful, then I'm going to handle the error, depending on how bad the error it is that this thing couldn't be opened. All right. In this case, I'm just logging it, but you know, you might have to involve the user at this point and say, well, I couldn't quite open that data file. Sorry. Otherwise, if the file does not exist, then you're just going to do almost the same thing. Save to URL for save operation, UI document save for creating. I've underlined for creating so you know that that's the kind of save you're going to do here. And again, if it's successful, the document's ready to go. We'll call documents ready and get started. If it's not, we'll log or handle the error. But I'm putting this comment at the bottom here to make it clear. I cannot do anything on this line of code with this document. Okay? Because those two calls are asynchronous. I have to wait for the blocks to be called, and then the blocks have to go invoke something. All right? Okay. Now, once a document is open and created, and like your document ready is get called, you can start using it. All right? Now, the documents do have what's called the document state. And I'm a big fan of checking your document state before you use it. All right? The most important document state is UI document state normal. That means this thing is open, ready to be used. Okay? Now, you probably should not get to document is ready, given the code on the previous slide, if it's not normal in a normal state, because you opened it yourself and you only called this if success was yes. But still, it's good to check it there. And then notice what I'm doing is, if my document state is normal, I'm getting the document context, and then I'm going to go do all my core data stuff. Create objects, get querying, get some out of the database, set their attributes, blah, blah, blah. Okay? I probably won't do it all right there in this method, but I can get started doing that now. What are some of the other document states besides normal? There's UI document state closed. That's what the document starts out in. When you do alloc init with your file URL, it's going to start out closed. Now, it'll be closed even if it doesn't exist on disk yet. Okay? In other words, you haven't created it. So when you see something in document state closed, it means you need to either open it or create it. There's saving error. That's the state it goes into if it calls your completion handler with success equals no from a save. This is a pretty bad situation. Hopefully it won't happen to you. You have to deal with it, right? You're going to have to get your user involved or whatever. Document state editing disabled can be a transient state. Okay, this is maybe the document is being reverted from a previous saved incarnation, or it's in the middle of saving, and so you can't edit it. There's some critical sections where this document is not in a position where it can be edited. So if the thing were ever in a disabled state, you'd have to somehow wait for it not to be. But one thing to not be too concerned about this is you're not going to be sitting at the event loop listening to user touches, and then all of a sudden, whoa, it's going to go disabled on you in the middle. It's going to be disabled because you are probably doing a save operation or something like that, and it's in the middle of that. And then the last state there, state in conflict, is a very interesting one for iCloud people. It can also happen in your own app too. I'll talk about that in a couple of slides. But so what happened here is you've got another version of the document that's different, and those two versions conflict. Okay, they're trying to touch the same objects in core data, maybe set the same attributes to something different. You have to manually resolve that conflict. So that's one of the hardest things about iCloud, is designing your schema so that if the user has a document open on their iPad too, and they've made some changes, and for some reason it hasn't been saved, or they couldn't access the network, and then they go over to their iPhone and they make the same or conflicting change there, then they both connect to the network, they both try to go to iCloud, they both come down, there's a conflict, and it has to be resolved. And I'm not sure whether I'm going to be able to go into detail about how you manage the resolution of these conflicts using the NS file version, but I hope to when we talk about iCloud. All right. The document state is often observed, okay, meaning there is a way in iOS to say, tell me when this document state changes, like tell me when it goes from closed to normal, for example, because then I'm going to go do something. Or tell me when a conflict arises so that I can immediately try and resolve the conflict or whatever. So how does this happen, this observing? It happens with a mechanism called NS notification. If you remember back to the very first day of this lecture, or the very first lecture of this course, I told you that one of the ways to communicate is the little radio station model. Do you remember that? Where you can kind of like broadcast information and someone else can tune in and listen. This is what that is, okay, NS notification. So this is a way for objects to basically sign up to be a radio station, and then other objects to tune in to that radio station. So how does that work? So here's where we're going to take a little aside here and talk about NS notification. It's actually very simple. You have to get a hold of an NS notification center, which is just an object that's kind of a clearinghouse. It's a radio station registration, if you want to think of it that way. The easiest way to do it is called NS notification default center. Now, you could have your own center, but usually we use the default center here. And then you're just going to send to the NS notification center this method, add observer selector name object. Okay, so add observer is you. You're going to have you be the observer. Selector is the selector you want sent to you when this radio station broadcasts. And we'll talk about what that method looks like. Name is the name of the radio station. This is a string that's a constant, almost always a constant, if not 100% of the time. It's a constant somewhere. Some class is telling you the name of the radio station you can sign up to. And then object is the object you want to hear from. So you can sign up to hear radio broadcasts from anyone who's broadcasting that station, or you can just say, I only want to hear it when this object broadcasts on that radio station. Okay? So if you say nil, that means anybody broadcasts, but that's rare to do that. Usually you're interested in some particular object broadcasting something like its document state. So let's look at the selector. So this is the selector that's sent to you. You get to specify the name of it, but the argument is always an NS notification star. Okay? What does an NS notification star look like? It has 3 properties on it. One is the name. That's the name of the radio station. Okay, that's the same name you specified above. Object, that's the object sending you this notification. That's the same as the object above, unless you specified nil, in which case whichever object ended up actually sending you something, this will be that object. This won't be nil. And then user info is just an ID. It could be anything, and it's up to the person who broadcasts on that radio station to tell you what it's going to be. And we'll see an example, for example, we'll see an example in a couple slides of what that thing can be. Usually it's something like a dictionary or something that contains the data that's important for that particular broadcast on that radio station. So let's look at an example here. This is the document state thing. So I just get the default center by saying NS notification center default center. Then I'm adding observer myself. The selector I want sent is document changed. The radio station I'm signing up to is UI document state change notification. This is an NS string that's defined in UI managed document. Actually, it's probably UI document.h. All right, so it's in UI documents header file. And then the object is the document I want to hear this from, so self.document in this case. Okay? So as soon as I send this message to the center, anytime the document state's changed, I'm going to get the message document changed with an argument being an NS notification. And I don't think the user info for that has anything in it. It's just nil, because you'll know the document will be the object sending you the notification. It doesn't have anything particular to tell you. Its state changed, so you're going to look at its state. One thing that's very important with notifications is to remove yourself as an observer when you're no longer interested. Okay, this is super important. And the reason this is super important is that NS Notification Center does not keep a weak pointer to you. It keeps what's called an unsafe, unretained pointer, okay, which is as unsafe as you can imagine, the name implies. An unsafe, unretained pointer can end up pointing to bad memory in the heap if you go away. So you want to make sure that you remove yourself before you go away. Now, there is a method called dealloc that every object gets sent just before it disappears from the heap. So you could certainly call this in dealloc. This would be one of the only methods you would ever call in dealloc, actually, because your object is almost completely gone, so there's not really much you can do. But more likely, you're going to send the add and remove in something like view will appear, view will disappear. Right? So let me show you an example of that. So here's another thing you can observe, which is to observe when changes happen in your core data database. Okay, which would be a really useful thing to know, right? This is when any code in your app uses a particular managed object context to change the database. Now, remember that it is possible to change a database with multiple different managed object contexts, which can get confusing, but like if you have multiple threads and things like that, it can be done. Usually you're only going to have one managed object context changing your database. But in any case, this radio station is the managed object context broadcasting to you anytime any object is added, deleted, or changed. Right? Its attributes are changed. So that's really useful to get. So how would you normally use this? Well, in view did appear, I'm going to add myself as an observer, because I don't really need to know what's going on in my database if I'm not even on screen, okay, whatever I'm displaying from that database. So I put it in view did appear here. And I just say self, selector is context changed in this case. The radio station is called NS Managed Object Context Objects Did Change Notification, right? Nice long name. And then notice in view will disappear, I remove myself as an observer for that radio station. Okay? So you see, and this is good because I'm never going to have that unsafe retained pointer pointing at me when I'm gone, because I can't go away until I disappear, right? I can't leave the heap while I'm still on screen. So this is a nice place to put this. There's another radio station called NS Managed Object Context Did Save Notification. So if you save your document, obviously the context gets saved. You'll get the save notification. So that's if you don't want the fine-grained notification, oh, this object got added, oh, this one got changed. You just want to find out when a batch of changes gets saved. Okay? So you can get that as well. It's a different radio station. But you see here how I'm using view will to disappear, and or view did disappear and view will. View did appear and view will disappear to kind of turn it on and off. Right? The overhead of these notifications is not cheap. As you can imagine, if every time you save something in your core data database, you're sending a message to somebody and creating up a dictionary of stuff of what changed, that's not cheap. So you don't want to be doing this unless you need to. You certainly don't want it going on when you're not on screen. All right, so if I did this, what would my context change method look like? You see, I'm saying I want to receive context changed, and it would be context changed NS notification. And this time the notification has a user info. And the user info is a dictionary. And that dictionary has 3 keys in it. One key is called NS inserted objects key. Another one's NS updated objects key. And the third one is NS deleted objects keys. These keys may or may not be there depending on what changed in the managed object context. And the value for these keys is an NS array of the NS managed objects that changed, that were inserted or deleted or their attributes changed. Okay? So you're getting the full description here of what changed in your context. Now, how do I know that this notifications user info has these? I read the documentation for NS managed object context, and it says, I broadcast on this radio station, and here's the things that I'll provide you in the user info. Got it? It's this documentation thing. Okay. What else can you observe besides the document state changing or context? And the answer is a lot of things. There's a lot. You can monitor what's going on in iOS. And you just look in the documentations. It's kind of like when you look at the documentation for a class, yeah, there's all the methods it sends, but you also want to usually scroll down to the very bottom and see, oh, what can I sign up for? What radio stations is this thing broadcast on so I can find out what's going on? And of course, you can broadcast on your own radio stations. This is not something that iOS gets to do internally. There's methods in NS Notification Center to say, post this notification to anybody who might be interested to this radio station. One thing I'll say about NS Notification, it seems really powerful and cool, and it is, but it can be easily abused. Because you know that global data is generally bad in your application. We want to be object-oriented. We want to pass things between objects, like when we're segueing and things like that. We don't want to be getting global data. It's very hard when you have global data to be sure that an object is working properly because you have to always know who might set that global data that it depends on. So be careful with NS notification. It makes sense in certain cases, but it can be easily abused. All right? It's not a mechanism to just bypass all argument passing and encapsulation rules and just start sending messages everywhere. Okay? All right, so that was it for NS notification. I just want to take a little aside there. You probably won't actually need to use an NS notification in your homework. Okay? So don't freak out about it too much. I'm not going to demo it, but you probably won't need to do it. You might want to use it in your final projects. It depends on what you're doing. All right, so back to managed document. Okay, so we opened or created this document. We got its context. We're doing a whole bunch of stuff in there to our database. Now we want to save it. Okay, now UI managed documents actually are auto-saved. They will automatically save things like when your application goes into the background, it's going to automatically save. Every certain amount of seconds, I can't tell you when, and it's not documented, it will also auto-save. Okay, but I'm a believer you don't want to really rely on auto-saving, okay? If the user does a batch of changes, they add some new bunch of objects or something like that, do an explicit save because the user is going to expect that stuff to be saved. And if something happens, the phone loses battery or something else, you wouldn't want to be in a situation where some data was lost. So you save with this method save to URL, the same thing we created with. It's just that we pass this different save operation called UI document save for overwriting. Okay? And the reason they have these two different save for overwriting, save creating is just so that whatever you intend actually happens. So if you call save for overwriting and the file doesn't exist, it's going to return success no. And vice versa. If you say save for creating and the file does exist, it's going to return success no. So this is just to make sure that your intent actually happens. But otherwise, it's the same method. Notice I've used a couple of interesting properties here in a UI document. One is file URL. So that file URL that I specified when I initted it, I can get it back. I can also change it. It's okay, and save this file off to a new, that's like when you do save as, right? You can basically do save as, change the file URL and save for creating, boom, create a new version of it. And then localized name is an interesting property. It is the localized name of the document from the user's point of view. This only makes sense once the thing has been saved and associated with a file, okay, and it's going to basically be the file name, the last part of the path that you did. But this, people get confused by this one because before it's been associated with a file and saved, this localized name will be nil. And so they're like, why is it nil? Okay, well, you got to save it first. Closing a document is also asynchronous. Okay, close with completion handler. All right, when would you close a document? Certainly, anytime you're done with that document, you should close it and give up any strong pointers you have to that UI managed document so it can go out of the heap. Okay, that's just, you know, memory management 101. You don't want to be holding on to things and leaving files open that you're not going to use anymore. You know, if a UI managed document does have no more strong pointers to it, it will automatically be closed. Okay, so if you just stop pointing to a UI managed document and no one else points to it, it'll get closed. Okay, so not to worry. You don't have to do explicit close. It's kind of like the autosave. You don't have to explicit autosave, but you know, generally you would want to do a close if you're looked at a document and you got the information and now you're done with it and maybe you moved on to another document. Okay, close the previous one, move on to the next one. But it's asynchronous, so notice that the next line, it's not closed yet. You have to wait until the block executes, then it'll be closed. All right, so can you have multiple instances of UI managed document that point to the same document on disk? And the answer is yes, you absolutely can. You want to be kind of careful in that situation. And the reason you want to be careful is they're like completely separate worlds. Each document, even though they're pointing to the same document on disk, they're completely separate worlds. Now, if the document changes on disk because one of the other ones modified it, then if you fetch again, if you fetch objects again, it will see those changes, okay, which is nice. However, if another one changes what's on disk, you won't automatically have fetching going on. So you'll see whatever the state of the world is the last time you fetched. Okay, you have to fetch again to get the changes that are on disk. So that can be confusing because if you have two UI managed object documents looking at the same file and you're happily changing one and your other one you're like, God, how come that thing never sees any change? Well, because you have to keep refetching it and you have to know when to fetch. You have to know this guy's saved so that you can go and fetch. So it's confusing. So in your homework, what I'm going to let you do is have global state for just this one thing. I'm going to let you have one copy of a UI managed document for each file on disk that you're going to be accessing, okay? So you'll use that same UI managed document instance, whether you're writing to it or reading from it, and that way you'll be using the same managed object context, and so all the automatic notification, noticing when things happen, that'll all happen for you because you'll all be using the same context. Question?
Can you post like a notification center whenever you edit a file?
Yeah, so the question is, could I post a notification, for example, every time I write to the file, and so that other documents would know, oh, I got to refetch? Absolutely you could. You absolutely 100% could do that. And in fact, we're going to see when we hook up a core data database to a table view, there's some automatic mechanism to do that in iOS so that we don't have to manage all of what's going on. It will automatically notice when changes are made to a context and automatically update the table, so you don't have to do anything. It's all completely magic as far as you're concerned. However, all that stuff only works if everything's in the same context. It doesn't do a thing where it posts notifications for other contexts to know to refetch. Okay, so it all has to be in the same context. So I want you to benefit from all that magic, and so that's why I'm going to allow you to say, okay, I'm going to have a global place. And I'm going to give you a hint in the assignment how to create a nice API for a global place to go get yourself a UI managed document for a document that you can then share in your app. Because your app is going to have one writer and a reader. Okay, you're going to write in just this one small place in your code, this visit button code that you'll see on Thursday when you see the assignment. But then you're going to be reading in another, like in another tab. Okay, so having the writer and the reader using the same instance of UI managed document rather than two different instances will benefit you greatly. Okay, so I'm going to let you do that. But it's perfectly legal. And some apps would definitely use two different managed documents, especially apps that are all reading, right? The writing comes from somewhere else, or apps where there's one writer and many readers. Okay? All right, that's it for UI managed document. All right, there's a lot of other stuff in UI management document and in UI document, but this is the basic stuff we need to know to encapsulate our core data database into a little document. So now we can get the NS managed context out of that document, and what can we do with it? Well, obviously we can insert and delete objects from the database, and we can update the attributes of objects and do a bunch of queries, okay, to find objects. Pretty sophisticated queries, same kind of things you can do in SQL. All right, so let's talk about all those things, how to do all those things with an NS managed object context. Okay, this context is the thing you get from the document, okay, and once you have it, now you can do all these things. So let's start with inserting objects in the database, because until we have some objects in there, we can't really do anything. And we do that with this method in NS entity description. And in iOS 5, there's actually other API, like in NS managed object context to do this. But we're going to do this using NS entity description class method called insert new object for entity for name in managed object context. Okay, so this is a class method. You give it the name of the entity. That's the thing that we typed in the Xcode visual mapper, like photo or photographer. And you give it a context, and it will insert a new object, empty. All the attributes will basically be nil unless they have some default value specified in Xcode. But you'll have an object, okay? So that's a good starting point to have this object. Again, all objects in the database are represented by NS managed object. That's why the return type, you see this NS entity description insert thing, returns an NS managed object star, right? So it returns you a pointer to that thing that it created. And so now that we have it, though, we need to set all its attributes and such. So how do we access these attributes? So I told you you could use the NS key value observing protocol, which is value for key and set value. Now, I'll take a little aside here. I'm not going to have a slide on this, but NS key value observing protocol, you notice has the word observing, and yes, you can actually observe property setting and getting in any object that supports this protocol for any of its properties, okay? So that's something you might want to look at too, and it looks very similar to NS Notification Center, okay, where you're basically saying, add an observer to watch this property on this object. And as long as that object implements this protocol for that property, you can do it. And this is how core data manages all of its data internally. It's watching what's happening with properties, other people setting objects, and make sure that everything gets put in the database right and committed properly and all that stuff. So you can use these raw value for key and set value for key to set your attributes, okay? And if you use that method set value for key path, remember that one that we used to do description dot underbar contents? If you use that, it'll actually follow your relationships, which is kind of cool. So you can have a key that's something dot something dot something, and it'll follow through. Like you could have a key on a photo called who took dot name, and it'll actually look through the who took, get the name out of it, and return the value for that key. Okay? If you use value for key path. Right? Value for key won't take the dots, but value for key path will. Okay, so the key is an attribute name like thumbnail URL or title or whatever, and the value is whatever stored in there. And just a reminder, too many relationships, this is going to give you back an NS set. Okay, if you say value for key, like value for key photos in a photographer, it's going to give you back an NS set. If it's a non-too many relationship, like who took, it's going to give you an NS managed object star or some subclass thereof. Binary values will be NS date, same thing as I said on the slide, okay? So this is the object you're going to get back when you call value for key. And if you call set value for key, you have to give it the appropriate type of object as well. The too many relationships, there's a switch in Xcode that says, I want this too many relationships to be ordered, okay? In other words, kept in order. If you do that, it's not an array, it's an NS ordered set, okay, which we talked about early in the foundation thing. But that's what's in NS order. That's what happens there. And that's the reason for that is if you added something multiple times that is the same thing, obviously you wouldn't want that row being duplicated in the database. So NS ordered set does not allow two things that are is equal to be added twice, whereas an array does. So that's why it's an NS ordered set. Changes that you make in your core data thing are all just happening in memory. Okay? None of them are actually going out to the SQL database until you save. Okay? When you save your UI managed document, they'll all go out to the SQL. Okay? The SQL statements will be generated to write them out. And of course, when it autosaves, that happens as well. Okay? So understand, though, that as you make all these changes to these UI managed objects, it's all happening in memory until you save. Then it does the SQL. But calling this value for key and set value for key leads to pretty messy code. You know, there's no type checking. Okay, it doesn't know whether it's an NS date you're setting or an NS number or whatever. And you got these literal strings like thumbnail URL sprinkled throughout your code. It's really kind of messy. So that's not usually the way we do it. Okay, what we really use is properties. Okay, but how can we have a property on an NS managed object that is who took, which is a photographer star instead of an NS managed object star, when NS managed object doesn't know about those things? And the answer is we're going to have to create subclasses of NS managed object. Okay, so we're going to create a photo subclass of NS managed object to represent the photo entity. We're going to create a photographer NS managed object to represent the photographer entity. Right, simple as that. And Xcode is going to help us with all this. Okay, it's going to do all that generation for us by magic. The thing it generates in the header file is just @property this, @property that for all your attributes. In the implementation file, it's not @synthesize. Because if you think about what @synthesize does is it creates an instance variable for that thing. And the storage for those properties is not an instance variable. It's in a SQL database. Okay, so there's some kind of magic in the implementation side, which we'll take a look at. But it's not synthesize. So how do we do this? How do we generate these photo and photographer subclasses of NS managed object? We just select them back in Xcode in this model file. You go to the editor menu and you go down to create NS managed object subclass. It's going to ask where do you want to store them. Right, so we're going to usually store them in the same place. There's a little switch there, use scalar properties for primitive data types. This will do things like if you have an integer, which is stored as an NS number star in the database, it'll actually make the property return an int. Or if it's a float in the database, it'll return a float instead of an NS number star. Okay, which is kind of cool, but be a little bit careful because things like NS dates turn out to be NS time intervals, which is the number of seconds since 1970, okay, which may not be as nice as an NS date. So you might not get what you want there, but that's what that does. So here's the two classes it generated for me. You see them up there, photographer.mnh and photo.mnh. Let's see what they look like. Here is photographer.h, and you can see that it created properties. We only have two attributes in the database for a photographer. One is the photographer's name, and the other one is that set of photos, right, the relationship to the photos. And now, what's really kind of cool is that it created a little category, which we'll talk about categories in a second, a little extra bit of API to be able to set values inside that NS set. Because you'll notice that NS set is not an NS mutable set. Right? So you might ask, how do I add a photo to the photos relationship? Well, there's two ways. One, you can use these little convenience methods that it automatically made for you, like add photos object, whatever. Or you can get the photos set, call mutable copy on it. Now you have a mutable set. Go add some objects to it, and then set photos back. Okay, call the setter for this property. Right? So you get it, mutableize it, change it, set it back. Yeah.
That value in the database, or does that wipe out that whole?
Well, when you set it, it sets the entire. That's going to when you. Yeah, the question is, does it update the database or does it wipe it out? Well, it completely wipes it out. But of course, you made a mutable copy of what was there before, so you're not losing any data when you add stuff to it, or even remove stuff for it. That might be what you want. So there's really those two ways to do it. There's also some nice method called something along the lines of mutable set for key or something like that, I think it's called, and it'll basically do the thing where it does a mutable copy of this thing for you, and then you can set the key too. So there's a lot of ways to mutate a relationship that's set here, but you can do whatever way you want, whatever API you see that looks good, go for it. Here's the photo.h. Now this actually was not properly generated by Xcode. Okay, so this is something you got to know about. You can see who took right there. Look at the type of who took. It's an NS managed object star. Wrong. Okay, that should be photographer star. Okay, now why is it not photographer star? It's because Xcode, when it generated these things, it generated one first. It must have generated what, photo first, yeah, and then photographer second. Okay. And so it hadn't generated the photographer subclass by the time it did this. So how do we fix that? Very simple. Just go back to Xcode and generate them again. okay? Because this time it knows that photographer has a subclass called photographer. So if I just regenerate them, then it's going to ask me if I want to replace them, okay? Which you're going to say yes, please replace. And now you're going to see that it's photographer star. Who took is a photographer star. Okay, so that's a little tricky thing to know when you first generate the things. That's the only time it matters, when you very first generate them, because it generates them serially. If there's dependencies on the class types, then they can be messed up. All right, so let's look at the .m's. Now, the .m's for these are pretty simple. They, for all the properties, do this thing called @dynamic. Okay, now we have not seen this. This is instead of @synthesize. What is @dynamic? Well, @dynamic tells the compiler, I know I didn't do an @synthesize for this property. Please do not generate a warning. I know what I'm doing. Okay, that's what @dynamic means. Okay, compiler just says, okay, it's like warning suppression, basically. So if these subclasses of NSManage objects don't implement these properties, what's going to happen? Well, the Objective-C runtime has a really cool feature where if you send a message to an object and that object does not implement that method, it gets a chance, the object does, to handle it anyway. Okay, go call some other method or something. Okay, do whatever it wants to try. It gets, it's like a little hook, you want to think of it that way, to get in there and get involved. And of course, what NSManage object does is anytime you send it a property thing, it just looks to see if it has an attribute with that name, and if it does, it calls value for key, or set value for key, okay, if you're setting. So that's all it's doing. It's just intercepting messages that it doesn't understand and turning them into value for key, or set value for key. Now, if you sent some, if you declared some property that's not an attribute and said this, then you would get an error or something along the lines of, this object is not compliant for foo, whatever your attribute is. It's not compliant for foo as part of the NS key value coding or key value observing protocol, right? You'll get some error along those lines, but that'll never happen because you're always going to use the .h of this, and it's going to define only the properties that are in there. Now, one thing is, every time you change your schema, you're going to want to regenerate these files, obviously, because you're going to have new properties or you remove properties or whatever. So that's a little bit of a problem, and we're going to talk about how to fix that in a second. So if I have these photo.mnh and photographer.mnh, how do I access my properties? Well, just using normal dot notation. So for example here, I say photo star photo equals NSEntity description insert new object for name photo in manage object context instead of NSManage object star that. And so now I can say my thumbnail equals photo.thumbnail URL because that's now a property on that thing. Or I can say photo.thumbnail data equals Flickr fetcher get the data. Or I can say photo.whotook equals some photographer star that I got out of the database by querying or something. Or I can even use multiple dots. Photo.whotook.name equals whatever. And it will traverse across the relationship of who took, find that that's a photographer, and set its name. Okay? So really cool. It makes your code very clean to use these subclasses, so we will always do that. Okay? Using the value for key and set value for key, it's just ugly. We don't want to do that. All right, so I told you I want to be able to regenerate my subclasses if I change my schema. So what about if I want to add code to my photo or photographer class? Okay, you can definitely imagine I would want to do that sometimes. Okay, I want to be nice and object-oriented. If I have some behavior that a photo has, I want to put that code in the photo class, right? I don't want to have it in some other random class. It belongs in photo. That's what object-oriented programming is about, encapsulating the responsibility for something in the class that's responsible for it. But if I did that and I changed photo.m, then the next time I change my schema and regenerate an Xcode, my code would be wiped out. Okay? Because and that's why it puts up that warning sign, replace these, and we had to click replace. Because it doesn't update it and try and work around your code, keep it in there. It replaces it. So how are we going to deal with that? We're going to use a new Objective-C language feature called categories. Okay? Now, some of you may have heard of categories. They have somewhat of a bad reputation in the Objective-C world, but they can be very valuable for some things, and they can be very seriously abused. Okay? So we're not going to abuse them. We're only going to use them for the valuable things. So another aside here, just like I took an aside within this notification, I'm going to take a little aside here with categories to explain what that is. So categories are an Objective-C syntax for adding methods or properties to a class without subclassing that class. Okay? Now remember that Objective-C, it's all dynamically bound at runtime, right? So when we send messages, it looks up in a table at runtime. Oh, where's the method for the method implementation for this thing? Okay, I'll go execute it. So given that it's all dynamic like that, it's easy for Objective-C to let you define methods somewhere else and then plug them in, okay, to that table. And that's basically the way it does. So you can add methods to classes that you don't even have the source for, or that are in completely different frameworks. In fact, let's talk about a couple of examples that you have heard about already. One is NSStrings draw at point with font method. So if you remember back when I talked about how to draw text in your draw rect, I said, oh, just send a message to NSString, draw at point with font. And you know, I probably mentioned that at that time, or if not, I'm sure you were thinking, what? You know, string is a foundation thing. It's not a UI thing. How could it possibly have draw at point? Well, the answer is UIKit adds this method to the NSString class, okay, in its framework, in UIKit, okay? And it's truly added this method to NSString. NSString now has this extra method that it didn't have before UIKit came along that adds this method. Same thing with NSIndexPath, okay? When you're in your table view, self-row index path, and you're saying indexPath.row, okay, you're sending the row, getting the row property from NSIndexPath. Well, rows and columns, that's a table view thing. That's a UI thing. Index paths are not about rows and columns, okay? So, rows and sections, rather. So, table view, UIKit is adding that property row and the property section to NSIndexPath, okay? So, you can do the same thing, right? And here's how you do it. The syntax looks like this. You just say @interface, the name of the class you want to add a method to, or methods to, parentheses, the name of your category. Okay, and this can be any word that you want. Obviously, you wouldn't want to pick the same name as, you can't pick the same name as someone else has picked if you are importing that header file as well. And usually we're going to pick a name for the category which describes what the methods in this category do. So actually add-on would not be a good name for a category. It's too generic, okay? You'll see when we do a category for our core data things, we'll pick better names. So here's and then you just, in between the @interface and end, you just put the name of the properties and the method that you're going to add. Okay, so this is the @interface. This would be in a header file called photo plus addon.h. That's the naming convention we use for categories. Class plus sign, name of the category.h. Okay, this is what would be there. Just as simple as that. Okay, now the category is not like a protocol. You're not just declaring these methods. You're actually got to provide the implementation for these things because you're going to add these methods to the class photo. So what does the .m look like? So here might be a .m. For this. So I'm adding this to the photo class. So I'm going to add these two methods. Okay, you'll remember isOld was a property, but it was read-only, so I only have to provide the getter. So I'm going to add the isOld property getter and the method image. And you can see that I'm implementing them in terms of self.something. Like the image data is NSData, data with contents of URL, self.photo URL. So I'm calling self here. Self being the photo that I added this method to. Okay, I've added method to all photos. All photos in the world now implement this method because I compiled this category into my application. Does that make sense? Same thing with isOld. I'm saying self.upload date, time interval since now, is less than 24 hours ago. Yeah?
Can these methods be only read-only, or can we also modify the object's properties?
What was the first part of that?
I mean, basically these extra methods that we provide for the class, can they modify the object's state or like?
Yeah, so the question is, can these category methods modify the object state? And the answer is absolutely, if they can get at it. Okay, in other words, if there's a public property like self.photo URL, you could definitely say self.photo URL equals something right here. Okay, you can do anything you want, anything you can get at. Now, the category usually, always, can't see the internal implementation of the class. They're just adding these things on the outside. So they can only use public API, basically, or API they know about to do stuff. But they can do anything they want, basically. Anything that they can see, any public thing they can see. The one major restriction of a category, however, is it cannot itself add instance variables. So you cannot have @ synthesize inside a category implementation. That is the major restriction of a category. It cannot add data to an object. You can understand why that is as well. Although it's actually possible, it would be possible for them to make that not be true in Objective-C, because the way Objective-C allocates storage for instance variables now is very extensible at runtime. So they could actually do it, but they currently don't. Okay? So what other kind of methods will we put in a category? Well, we might put a nice property on a category of an NS-managed object to access Boolean attributes. Instead of having NS number star, we could have them actually be a bool. Or to convert an NS data to something if we didn't want to use the whole transformable thing, which is basically what we're doing with image. It's just transforming an NS data attribute into a UI image. Okay? So having shown you this, I will say it can be very much abused. I would say the #1 place it gets abused is when someone in a category tries to define a method that's already defined in the class. Okay? Doing that, usually your category will override what's in the class, but that's a very dangerous proposition because the person who wrote the class originally, they had a certain idea for what the semantics of that method is, and if you override it and try to do something else, you know, if a new version comes out or if some subclass is using that method and you're basically inserting your new version in, you could break everything. So my rule is I never add a method that's already in a class in a category. I only add new methods, okay, to add new functionality. And if you do that, you'll stay away from trouble with categories. It can also be abused where people go around and they're adding a lot of methods to fundamental core classes, trying to, you know, change their behavior and all that. And, you know, again, as long as you're not trying to replace a method, usually you won't get into too much trouble. So what's the most common category that we add to an NS-managed object subclass, like photo or photographer? Creation. Okay? We very commonly have a photo create category, and what it does is provides a factory method to do that insert new object for entity for name. It does that for you. And why do we do this? Because usually inserting a new object in the database is not enough because that photo has all nil attributes, right? So here's an example of where I'm saying, give me a photo with this following Flickr data. And so it does the insert new entity for name, but then it takes all the Flickr data and then gets all the attributes up into some nice state and then returns it. And you see how it's nice and object-oriented to have the photo object do that instead of some class that's trying to use a photo somewhere, right? So anybody now who wants to create a photo, if they happen to have some Flickr data for a photo, they can call this on the photo class, right? Now to call this method, you do have to import this category's header file, the photo plus create.h header file, just so that you have the method signature of this method, okay? But then you can call this method on photo. You don't say, the calling of this is just like you're calling it on photo, the photo class, because it's really added this method to photo. Okay, back to NS-managed object context. What can you do? You've seen how to insert methods. You've seen how to use categories even to create a nice method to do insertion. What about deletion? Well, it's incredibly easy to delete objects in the database, sometimes almost too easy. You just say managed object context, delete object, the object. Okay? Now, the reason I say this is too easy is you got to think a little bit when you delete an object, what are the ramifications? What's going on inside the database? What if there are relationships that point to this thing and it points to other things? And you got to make sure your database gets to a normalized state, a state where it makes sense if you just delete an object out of the middle of it. And I told you about in Xcode you can set the delete rule so that cascading will happen or whatever, but there might be other things you want to set. And there's a really nice method that you can implement in a category called prepare for deletion. This method will get sent if it's implemented by a NS-managed object subclass. This will get called when it's going through deletion. In other words, if someone calls delete photo, part of that process is it's going to call prepare for deletion. And inside prepare for deletion, you wouldn't have to do something like, say, who took equals nil or something like that. You don't have to worry about your relationships. They'll get set up that way. But what if you had something in who took, your photographer, which is like a count of how many photos it had? You might want to update that count by reducing it by 1 because you're about to get deleted. You're a photo. Does that make sense? So in other words, you might update other state in your database knowing that you're going away. You haven't gone away by the time this is called, but you're going to. You know, it's irrevocable that you're going to go away. One other thing to be careful of when you delete an object, generally don't want to keep a strong pointer to that object anymore, okay, because it'll be deleted from the database. It'll still be there, you'll have a pointer to it, but it'll be in a deleted state. You know, it won't fault data in. If you ask attributes on it, you're not going to get data, things like that. So generally, you want to not have any strong pointers to things you deleted. All right. So you can insert things, you can get the values of the properties, you can delete things. What else do you want to do with a managed object context? Well, the last and most important thing is query. Okay, you need to be able to pick objects out of the database. All right, so how do you do this? You do this by creating and executing an NSFetchRequest object, okay, which you're going to ask, you create one, then you're going to ask the managed object context to execute that fetch for you. So there's 4 important things to know when you're creating a fetch request. One, you got to specify the entity you're going to fetch, a predicate which says which objects in the database you want. Okay, that's like your search criteria. A sort descriptor, because this fetch is going to return an array, meaning an ordered list of objects. So you have to specify what order you want those things in. And then you can control a little bit of how many to fetch at a time and how many per batch, things like that. So this is what creating a fetch request would look like approximately, and we're going to go through each of these lines. The first thing is specifying the kind of entity. One thing that sometimes messes people up is when you do a fetch in core data, that fetch only returns one kind of entity. Okay, you can't do a fetch that returns some photos and some photographers. No. Okay, every fetch either returns all photographers or all photos. Okay, or in the database sense, you can only fetch from one table. Right? You can only get the items out of one table at a time. So you got to specify what that table is, which entities you're trying to get. Okay? Setting the, I'm going to skip the size and limits, but suffice to say you can get them in batches. You don't need to do that for your homework. You're going to have small amounts of data anyway. The sort descriptor, like I say, it specifies the order of the array you're going to get when you execute this fetch request. The sort descriptor is created using this method sort descriptor with key on NS sort descriptor. The key is just which key in that entity you're going to sort by. Ascending is whether it's going up or down. And then the selector is not necessarily an Objective-C selector. You specify it as such, but actually some of these Objective-C selectors are specially handled, and this sorting happens on the database side. Okay? In other words, SQL commands to do the sorting are happening and returning the thing pre-sorted from the database, but you don't know that. You're going to look in the documentation and see, you know, if I'm fetching a string, what kind of methods in string can I do to compare? And if you pick something that's not implemented in the database, well, it'll sort it on the client side, which is going to be expensive. Okay? But of course, string, all these things like localized case insensitive compare and all those things, all are implemented on the database side, not to worry. The other thing that's interesting is the fetch request does not take a sort descriptor, it takes an array of sort descriptors. Okay, why does it take an array of sort descriptors? Well, because you might want to be sorting by last name, and then within last name, sort by first name, right? So in other words, that's why you want multiple sort descriptors. Often you're only passing one sort descriptor, but sometimes you'll pass multiple. Predicate. Okay, so this is the guts of how you specify which objects you want. So if I were going to like give me all the photos that have thumbnail URLs that are served up by server Flickr5, okay, then I would create this predicate using predicate with format, which is thumbnail URL contains %@, and then I would give the server name Flickr5. So it looks a little bit like NS string with format, and it is very much like that, except for that obviously the contents have semantic meaning. Okay, and there are lots of different examples. You're going to have to look at NS predicate and look up. There's a link there called the Predicate Programming Guide, and you're going to look at all the things you can do. But here's some examples. You can obviously check to see if something is equal to something else, right? If a unique ID is equal to a string or something, like that might be how you unique photo objects in a database by comparing them to the Flickr ID. There's contains. There's also contains just means is a substring there, but also notice the little square bracket C. That means case insensitive. Okay, so that's a case insensitive substring search. There's also greater than and less than, especially useful for dates and integers, right? So here I'd be saying viewed greater than some date. It gives me all the objects that where the viewed attribute, which would be some attribute that's an NSDate attribute. You can also follow through dot notation. So here I'm doing a photo search of who took dot name equals something. So that's giving me all the photos where the photographer's name is that. Okay? Let that soak in. Right? So even though I'm doing a fetch into the photo table, I'm using a key in the photographer's thing by going through my relationship to photographers. Similarly, I could say, give me photographers where any of their photos' title contains this. Okay? So this is quite powerful here. You can do quite powerful searches, and this is all going to get turned into SQL underneath and happen really fast, like as fast as possible, really humanly possible to have a generic searching is what's going to happen. All right, so you want to look up NS predicate to understand that. There's also compound predicates. You can say or and in your format. There's also or and predicate objects that let you build trees of NS predicate objects. So that's that. All right, so putting it all together, here's an example. If I wanted to create a query for all photographers, so the request is going to be into the photography table, who have taken a photo in the last 24 hours. So I'm going to get what yesterday is. That's the date time interval since now, minus 24 hours. And the predicate's going to be any photos that have an upload date that's greater than yesterday. Okay? Understand that predicate? So I'm looking through my photos relationship to all my photos and finding if there are any in there where the upload date is greater than yesterday, then it's going to match this photographer. And I'm querying for photographers here. Then I'm going to sort by the photographer's name by creating a sort descriptor with the key as name. And then I'm going to create an array with just one object in it, which is that sort descriptor, and set that on my request. Okay? So now I've got this request. Here's how I execute the fetch. I send a message to the manage object context, which I probably got from my document, called execute fetch request. I pass it the request and also a pointer to an error pointer so that I can get an error back. And this execute fetch request, really simple semantics, okay? If it returns nil, there was an error. And you'll have to look at the error that was returned there to find out what it was. If it returns an empty array, okay, this thing returns an NS array, notice. If the array returns as empty, not nil, but empty, nothing matches your search. Okay? Exactly what you would think. There were nothing matched. Otherwise, it returns an array of NS manage objects, right, that match your search. Okay? It's an array. It's ordered by the sort descriptor. If you're not interested in any error return values, you can just pass null for that second argument error. Okay? That's really it, because we're out of time. But this data does not come back all at once. If you ask for 1,000 or 1,000,000 objects, you're not going to get 1,000,000 objects in memory. It faults them in as you start accessing them. It's smart about that, as you might imagine. So the only thing about that is if you NSLog an NSManage object to the console, because you're debugging or whatever, if it's been faulted, if it's actually been brought out of the database, you'll get a nice description of it. It's really good for debugging. But if it hasn't been faulted yet, it'll just say unfaulted object or something like that. Okay, so that's not going to be of any help to you. So just so you know about that. All right, so that's it. That's all I'm going to talk about today. There's lots more I could talk about in core data optimistic locking and undo and redo. It does full undo and redo. Thing about staleness of fetching, all that. We don't have time for any of that, unfortunately. So what's coming up on Thursday, I'm going to talk about more core data, specifically how you hook a core data database up to a table view, because a table view is a great way to look at the data in a core data table view. And then on Friday, we have a section, we have a guest speaker, Mike Gaffery from Yelp. It's going to be an awesome one if you're interested at all in what's it like to market and sell an iOS app in the real world. This guy has sold many different kinds of apps, from the most expensive app offered on the App Store all the way to working at Yelp and doing very mainstream integration. So you probably don't want to miss that one on Friday. Okay, that's it. Sorry to go over a little bit. I'll be here if you have questions.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.